Today we're going to talk about The Spirit of the Samurai, a stop-motion action platformer inspired by Japanese folktales with a dark horror vibe. Hi all, it's the Dove here to give you an inside look at Digital Mind Games' latest installment, The Spirit of the Samurai. Now, I don't want to bury the lead or beat around the bush here. I do not recommend The Spirit of the Samurai in its current state. I think given some time and a few adjustments, this could be a better game, and I believe the developers are at least open to making fixes to improve the gaming experience. They have recently released a patch that alleviates a bit of the issues gamers were having, but it still isn't at a point where I would recommend it to a fellow gamer. There actually are some cool parts here and there, so I definitely don't think all is lost, but let's just take a look. Story-wise, you take over a samurai in a Japanese village, which is almost instantly overtaken by a demon horde from the underworld. The story is one of the better parts of the game, too. The lore, the building up of a journey, and the characters come together to get interest high initially. Sadly, when you start control of your character, the game is a bit of a slog. You can't move far while running, and you have to walk back and forth across the map, with a stamina bar that drains rather quickly. Once everything actually gets going, the main game is split up into a couple different sections where you play as 3 different characters. The first is the human version of a samurai. This part of the game will focus primarily on combat and a little bit of exploration. This chunk of the Spirit of the Samurai would probably be where most Souls-like players feel most at home. You have a similar inventory system, similar rigid but challenging combat, and of course the aesthetics really lean towards the Souls-like universe. But that's where the Souls-like elements honestly end. There is a checkpoint and XP system, but you don't get to reclaim XP by getting back to your previous point, which to me is an absolute hallmark of Souls-like games. You also take over as the main protagonist, Kitten. These parts of the game are pretty much either platforming or they call back to games like Little Nightmares, or the upcoming Reanimal, where you're trying to hide behind objects from scary monsters as you pass through a predetermined path. This part of the game is streamlined. You are pretty much just moving around and running from object. There's no real strategy or exploration in these parts. It's there just to connect the story and maybe get a good jump scare out of you. The third character you control is a tree spirit, which is a small glowing mummy. As silly as it sounds, this is actually the best part of the game in my estimation by far. It feels like it's casting aside the stop motion capture stuff and focuses more on the movement and the overall mechanics in combat. All the while, it still allows you to do some platforming. I can't stress enough how much this part of the game should have just been the whole game in my mind. It was so much easier to see what your character was doing. When fighting in human form, everything just kind of blends together, and it's incredibly hard to tell the difference between your character, an enemy, and the game's foreground. The glowing tree spirit helps distinguish between all the commotion and makes combat a lot more enjoyable. There are also a couple levels where the kitten joins either the tree spirit or the human form, and it tries to stagger enemies, but it's nothing you control. It's honestly just not as helpful as one would hope. Overall, the parts of the game where you play as the human and the tree spirit have very similar controls. They're almost identical. The human form allows you access to your inventory like any normal action game, and it limits you to the amount of ranged weapons that you actually have. The tree spirit restricts you from the inventory, but it allows you to draw a ranged attack that is powered by your health bar. You regain health by defeating enemies in this form, so you can loop the ranged attack well with your combos without worry. That's the biggest differences between the two forms, a few other tiny things here and there. The combat in this game is actually where I think it shines. It's very innovative in the fact that you control the moveset, and each attack has its own strengths, weaknesses, and damage rate. You can see the change in animation each attack has. This extent of breaking down a moveset is something you don't often see in an action platformer, so this was a real treat to see it implemented here. And those different attacks and animations matter. Some opponents can hit you from afar with either a spear or the long legs of a spider. so using a wind-up type attack might leave you vulnerable. You'll also have some slower, more methodical enemies, and that's where you might want to get the wind-ups and get the massive damage. But it all comes to whether or not your chain of animations work properly. There's no definitive guide in the game, but I noticed lining up the feet in the animation and linking them together gives you some of the quickest combinations. But honestly, just go nuts and see what happens. Another aspect of combat that I enjoyed was the fact that the game allows players the option to use the right analog stick to control combat. At first, I wasn't sure about this. A good old-fashioned button press for platformers works just fine, but this allows players to flick the analog stick in the direction of oncoming attacks and then flick it in the other direction when the enemies are on both sides of the screen. You don't know how awesome this feature is until it's implemented, and it actually works quite well. The greatest strength of the Spirit of the Samurai was honestly its biggest weakness, and that is the stop motion capture and the art direction. It can make for some incredibly beautiful screens, and it does a terrific job of setting that dark, ominous, yet retro look. It reminded me of Mortal Kombat. But sometimes it just went a little too far. In particular, sometimes the foreground got in the way of the enemies attacking you. Sometimes enemies would just spawn behind a column and you didn't even know they existed until you were killed by them. Sometimes you couldn't see a wall at the edge of a platforming area because it just blended in. And that went double for some areas where you just weren't sure if the floor was indeed a floor or not. The absolute worst part for me was the fire. It is just incredibly confusing, and with a game using retro-style graphics like this, it is incredibly hard to pick up on some of the subtleties of whether or not a big flaming area is actually going to hurt your character or not. There were a few times where the only way to tell if a fire was going to hurt your character was to just run right into it. After you've been platforming for a while, or you just finished taking down a slew of enemies, that's the last thing you want to guess whether or not it's going to kill your character or not. It can be extremely frustrating, to say the least. The last part I was going to critique was actually addressed by the developers. In certain platforming parts, your character could not see where they were going to land, forcing you to literally take a leap of faith. Not what gamers want to do in a checkpoint system game. In the most recent patch notes, the developers have said they zoomed out these areas in particular. And although this adjustment shows the commitment Digital Mind Games has, it still isn't enough for me to recommend the game in the current state. I saw early previews saying that this was a Souls-like with some Metroidvania hints, but it's honestly its own kind of thing. I wouldn't really put it in either genre, nor would I compare it to something like Nine Souls, which to me is a first-class example of a great Metroidvania mixed with some Souls-like. But that's not what the Spirit of the Samurai is or was really even going for. What I can say about the Spirit of the Samurai is the versatility of different playstyles is intriguing. This title isn't afraid to shake things up a bit, especially with the controls and the overall format. The art absolutely works with any kind of Souls-like vibe that they might have been going for, or just that dark horror theme. It's creepy and the demonic creatures are well done. The little details that you see in some of them are both terrifying and beautiful. One character they absolutely nailed in my estimation was Kitsume. It isn't a dark or demonic creature, it is bright and beautiful, and you can tell that the developers really took their time with this particular build. The story is also interesting, and as I don't know much about Japanese folklore, I didn't know what to expect. The characters all have their own personalities, and everything just goes well together. It's a creepy adventure, and I think for Souls-like fans, they would definitely enjoy this part of the game. The immersion aspect can feel a bit wonky at times. It was hard to tell exactly what kind of emotions were supposed to be displayed by the characters because of the animations. They weren't bad per se, but the humans seemed very stiff, especially when it came to facial expressions. There were still a couple good scares here and there, and the dark atmosphere and characters worked well together. The Spirit of the Samurai isn't for everyone. I would only recommend this title to gamers who aren't afraid of the game's flaws. If you don't mind retrying parts due to the lack of vision or a wonky platforming control system, then maybe give the Spirit of the Samurai a try. It has some innovative combat and some interesting combinations of gameplay. It also has a creepy demonic vibe, if that's your thing, and some truly remarkable artwork to go along with the folklore. If you stuck around this long and are still interested, it's not the biggest risk to try the game, as it's under $20 before any sales that Steam's gonna throw your way. The Spirit of the Samurai, available on Steam. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a comment or hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider clicking the subscribe button now. We have more videos like this and have a weekly gamer news podcast called The Gamer Buff, with all the latest gaming news. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, this is the Dove.